As we continue our study of the historical books, we look at the creation of the monarchy, or in other words, the office of the king. The next two sessions will focus on this story as found in 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, and 1st and 2nd Chronicles. In the Old Testament, these 6 books were originally just 3 books: Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles. They were divided by Christians to make them more manageable. The book of Samuel focuses on the creation of the monarchy and on the lives of 3 people: Samuel, Saul, and David. Samuel was the last judge who God used to select Israel's first 2 kings. The first half of 1 Samuel focuses on his story. There, we see Saul anointed as the first king of Israel. The second half of 1 Samuel tells his story, with a bit of emphasis upon young David. David was the second and greatest king of Israel, and the book of 2 Samuel tells his story. The dominant issue in 1 and 2 Samuel is the creation and the beginning of the monarchy. The material you read in 1 Samuel chapter 8 focuses on how Israel came to have a king. If you recall, there seem to be 2 factors that encourage Israel to have a king. First, Samuel's sons were doing a poor job. The Israelites wanted better leadership and to be like the other nations. Second, they rejected God as king and begged for a new leader, but God did not intend for Israel to be like other nations. Their request to Samuel was really a way of replacing God. Through Samuel, God made it clear to the people what they could expect from a king. Do you recall the warnings God gave them in 1 Samuel chapter 8? The king would exploit them, dominate them, and they would be his slaves and do his bidding. In 1 Samuel chapter 8, verse 17, Samuel writes that the king would take 1/10 from the Israelites, the tithe set apart for God, as a way of saying he is replacing God. However, despite these warnings that you saw come to pass in your reading, the people still demanded Samuel appoint them a king. Why then, if God is opposed to the Israelites having a king, does he tell Samuel to seek out a particular person and anoint them? Is God blessing a bad decision? A decision he is opposed to? In a sense, this act demonstrates God's benevolence and love. In the midst of the Israelites' bad choice, he still seeks the best for them. If the Israelites seek a king, God still wants them to have the best king possible. Even though the Israelites opposed God, God did not oppose them. The first king of Israel was Saul. If you recall your reading from 1 Samuel chapter 9, we are not told much about why he was selected. It says he was a tall, handsome man who was a good fighter. Perhaps this was the kind of person the Israelites, not God, wanted. You also read about his early success. In 1 Samuel chapter 13, you read of his military victories over the surrounding people, something that surely pleased the Israelites. However, the early story of success is quickly followed by the decline of Saul. The book of Samuel emphasizes 3 key failures by Saul. First, in 1 Samuel chapter 13, Saul sins by offering up a sacrifice prior to a battle. What was so wrong with this? There are 2 key problems. The first problem is that the Mosaic covenant, as expressed in the book of Leviticus, made clear that only particular people in particular ways could offer up the sacrifice. This was, after all, using a limited and flawed thing to come before a great God. The second and more important problem is about why Saul offered up the sacrifice. Do you see that he was not motivated out of a desire to worship God, but as a way of rallying the people? He was using the worship of God for very selfish motives. Second, Saul sins in forcing the people to adhere to a very uncompassionate curse. In 1 Samuel chapter 14, Saul is so angry in the midst of battle that he commands his people not to eat anything for the rest of the day, or face death. Not only is this a harsh command, but when his son, Jonathan, not knowing the command of his father, ate that day, Saul sought to kill him nonetheless. Third, Saul was disobedient to God. In 1 Samuel chapter 15, Saul is commanded to conquer Amalek and to destroy everything. Saul disobeys by keeping King Agag alive as a sort of trophy, and by keeping all of the valuable items they find in battle for themselves. These three key sins led to God rejecting Saul as king. Throughout the story of Saul, we see glimpses of Israel's second king, David. The book of Samuel tells us a peculiar story about David. Yes, he acts with bravery to kill Goliath, but at the same time, he hides and fights with the Philistines. The entire time that Saul is king, David grows in power and popularity. Saul witnesses this and grows violently jealous of David, often seeking to kill him, but with no success. David is the second and greatest king of Israel. He rises to power after the death of Saul. Remember that perspectives in the historical books can vary, and David's story is shown in a more negative and sinful light in the book of Samuel than in any other historical books. We will explore some of those differences in later sessions when we look at the book of Chronicles. There are three parts to David's story. The first part is his rise to power and his military success. The last part is a story of decline, of death in his family, and of revolt. Separating these two is the pivotal story you read, David's encounter with Bathsheba and Uriah. The book of 1 Samuel tells us of the failures of King David, a king out of control. But the story is not just about the sexual sin of David. Samuel tells us that the king failed in leadership, in sexual behavior, in personal relationships, in keeping the Mosaic covenant, and in spiritual awareness. David's adultery with Bathsheba was only part of the king's failure. For example, do you recall how the story started? It tells us that in the spring, when kings usually went out to battle with their troops, David stayed at home in Jerusalem. From the first words of the chapter, we see failure. He fails to lead his people, he commits adultery, he violates the Mosaic covenant's laws about sex, and he tries to hide his sin by calling Bathsheba's husband back to Jerusalem. When Uriah shows more self-control than the king, David tries to get Uriah drunk and make him sleep with Bathsheba, his wife. But even drunk, Uriah has more self-control than David does sober. David decides to murder Uriah and sends him to the front lines to carry out his own death sentence. Throughout this passage, you should note not only the multiple failures of David, but also the way Uriah is the opposite of David. Uriah is everything David should be. Uriah is with his people. Uriah has self-control. Uriah is honest. Uriah is self-sacrificing. David's failures are eventually found out when he is challenged by the prophet of God, Nathan. David's sins so cloud his heart that he cannot recognize them even when the prophet Nathan is talking about him. The story of David, as with the story of Saul, emphasizes the corrupting nature of power. Taken together, the book of Samuel does not just tell us the story of the origins of Israel's monarchy and Israel's first kings. It also gives us an evaluation of the first kings of Israel. You see this evaluation in the way the story is told. The desire for a king is born out of a rejection of God. Israel's first king violates the Mosaic covenant, is uncompassionate, and disobeys God. Israel's second king, while having more success, fails in his leadership responsibilities, commits adultery and murder, and is so spiritually dead that he cannot understand the message of the prophet of God. In the books of Chronicles and Psalms, we see a positive view of David, one we are more familiar and comfortable with. However, the book of Samuel begins with a story about how the kings of Israel are a replacement of God as king. Samuel's criticism of the monarchy is also seen in the story of David. This very flawed individual is the best king Israel will ever have. The historical books of the Old Testament represent the community of faith and present similar topics from different perspectives. Many times we see a correlation between the books. An example is how we learn different views of kings and judges and 1 and 2 Samuel. We will see variations of this theme in the next session. For now, let's consider how the lessons of Samuel, Saul, and David relate to our lives by answering the relational questions.